Hey everyone, welcome to CIS 234 Week 2, Front-End Web Development. So as a reminder, I'm Dan Rusk and I like this picture of myself, so I'm going to show it pretty much every time, I guess, until you like it too. So maybe infinity times. And this week we're going to be talking about Git and how to actually submit a project with this. And you're going to go ahead down in the links and download Git and get it set up on your computer before continuing with this video. Next, we're going to talk about the CSS3 grid layout module. Now, grid layout is something I'm super excited about. It's really new. It's supported by all major browsers, and it makes doing layouts so easy. And inside that, we're going to touch on some of the HTML5 semantic elements. And we are going to do responsive web design using grids, which is another power of grid that makes it so cool that you can make a mobile version and a desktop version of your site in a really straightforward, simple way. So watch the rest of the video to learn all this good stuff. For this class, we're going to be using Git. Now, before you jump into this video, I recommend going here, if you're not familiar with Git yet, and checking the Git handbook. Now, this Git handbook will go over what a version control system actually is, what Git is as a distributed version control system, and then why Git. In addition, it'll talk about repositories. Now, when we start a new project or when we start the lab, we get a new repository, and it'll look like something like this. This is the empty repository on GitHub. So in our empty repository, we have these commands to create a new repository on the command line. Now, the command line is a terminal on your computer that we can run these commands in to actually initialize a local copy of this repository. Now, the repository is empty, so we can put it into an empty WebStorm project. So I created a WebStorm project, and I'm going to initialize the Git repository here. So if I go to the terminal, I have access to the command line now. So in this command line, we're going to go through these commands one by one. So this first one is going to create a readme.md file. Now, if you don't know exactly what this does yet, don't worry, you just can run it. It's safe, trust me. So this will create a README you'll see up here. If we double click on it, we see it has the contents hashtag git-example. That's what it was right here. Next, we're going to run git init. Now this just initialized an empty Git repository in this projects folder. Next, we are going to stage this readme.md file, the creation of it, into Git. Before we stage something, it's not even considered to be part of our Git repository, but once we stage it, it becomes part of our Git repository, and Git will start tracking changes on them. Now we're going to go ahead and commit that stage. So we see one file change, one insertion, create mode, readme.md. So that's just listing the files that were created with that last commit. Now we're going to add a remote origin, and this is going to be linked to your repository. And here is where we're going to send our changes. So we do git push -u origin master. So now our repository is up on GitHub. If we go back to the repositories page, we see it still looks like an empty repository. That's because we need to refresh the page. So let's refresh it. There it is. So now we see our readme.md file. Now we are going to talk about grids. Grids are a revolutionary way to lay out content on a web page. As of last year, they became supported by all major browsers, which means we can use them. Yay! So when we go to caniuse.com, we can see that grid is now supported. So I want you to read a couple articles and examples about grids before continuing with this video. And this first article is about how the grid came to be and why this is so revolutionary and how we do layouts. Then after you check out grid in CSS3, how it was created, I want you to check out grid by example, and this will show you how grids can be used in CSS3. It'll go through defining a grid, which is important, and it'll go through some of the concepts of grids. Now, one important resource as well is the complete guide to grid on CSS tricks. Now, this starts explaining how the grid is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system, and it goes into this important terminology. So this terminology contains important concepts that you'll need to understand in order to work with the grid. The first one is the grid container. So the grid container is the parent of all of the things you want to lay out on this two-dimensional system. So that's easy enough. That's the container. And we're going to look into how that uses display grid. So let's try this out. So let's create a grid container first and foremost. So create a div, and we'll put a class on here of container. So now we're going to create an embedded style sheet to make that div a grid container. So this container, is just a class. It could be named whatever you want. But the important part is to make a grid container, it needs to have display grid. And that's it. Now this can contain grid items, which we'll talk about right now. A grid item is what is actually going to be laid out on the grid. So each of these grid items is going to take up a cell in the grid. So the grid items are defined just by being the direct child of the grid container. So this div class container has that display grid property that we see here. And these divs that are all direct children of the container are the grid items. We don't need to do anything special for them. We have the class item here that's just a style later. But really, no CSS is needed to define these divs as grid items. Now notice this sub item here is inside of this div. So this is not a direct descendant of the container. It is a child of this element here. So this does not count as a grid item. Let's add some grid items to our container we made in our code. So to do that, we're just going to create 4 divs that each have a number inside of them. It's just so we can see where they lay out later. Alright, that's it. Now we have 4 grid items in our grid. Let's go read some more terminology. So next term we're going to talk about is grid line. So these are the dividing lines that make up the structure of the grid. You don't actually see these in the grid, but you can reference them in your CSS to define positioning. Now this is a more advanced way to position items that we're going to talk about later, so I'm not going to go into an example of these yet. The next term is grid track, and this refers to the rows or columns of the grid. So it says a space between 2 adjacent grid lines. So we saw our grid lines border the tracks. So this is a column track and a row track, but they're just referenced as tracks. In the style for the grid container, we're going to be able to set the height of the rows tracks and the width of the column tracks, and we'll be able to define how many tracks there are for each. So let's look at our grid container we created here, and let's go ahead and pull this up in Chrome. So notice by default our 1, 2, 3, 4 are stacked on top of each other. So there's one column that we're working with in this grid. Let's change this into a 2 by 2 grid by adding some grid tracks. First, I'm going to add some styling to make these divs stand out a little better. Next, I'm going to add 2 columns for our grid. I do that with the grid template columns property. Now I'm going to define the widths of these columns. So I can specify a absolute unit, or I can do relative units or percentage units. So let's first do a exact unit. So we're going to say there are 2 columns, and each one is going to be 100 pixels. So we can specify as many columns as we want, just separated by a space. Go ahead and save that and refresh and see what happened here. Now see, we have a 2x2 grid. It automatically created a new row because we only specified the number of columns we had. So one of the cool things about grid is it just will build the rest of the grid for you. It auto place the items in, based on your rules. So let's try to expand this into the whole browser. So one way we can do that is to switch this to a fractional unit. So we can say the first one is going to take up 1 fraction of the space, and the second one is going to take up another fraction of the space. Now our first item takes up half of the space, and the other one takes up half the space. The last 2 terms you need to know are grid cell and grid area. So these are both conceptual ideas that will limit some of the things later. So a grid cell is kind of like a table cell. It's a single unit of the grid. It is bordered by 2 adjacent column lines and 2 adjacent row lines. So that's always contained between these 4 lines. Now grid area is an area that makes a rectangle using 2 grid lines, 2 column grid lines, and 2 row grid lines of your choosing. Now we'll be able to define grid areas later to do row spans and column spans very easily. Now let's do a little bit more to our code to play with grids to fill up the entire page we see over in our example here. So how about we want to span the entire height of the page. So let's make our container height 100 of the viewport height. If we do that, we see now that our grid is spanning this entire viewport height now. The body has some margins here, so we'll use a reset style to get rid of those margins. And we'll go ahead and set the padding to 0 as well. And I'll spell margin correctly. Now our grid is the entire browser window. Now these are all smushed together, so we can't really see the grid cells. That'll be neat if we could see the grid cells, right? So let's add a grid gap. This will put a gap between the rows and columns. You can specify just a column gap and a row gap. We're going to do both at the same time. And we're just going to go ahead and make that 1 rem. Now we can see a separation between the grid items, and we can see some clear grid lines. Next, let's pretty up these divs a tiny bit so we have the numbers in the center here and a little bit larger. So to align content in the very center of anything, I like to use the flex box. So we're going to turn these grid items into flex boxes, and then we're going to justify the content to center and align the items to center. We'll go over flex boxes in more detail later in this semester, but for now, this is how you center the items inside of it. So we can go check it out, see if it worked. So now our numbers are in the center. Let's make them larger. We'll change the font size. We'll quadruple their size. Now it's looking pretty, huh? Now let's say we want this first grid cell to span multiple rows. How do we do that? So let's look at the properties for grid items in the CSS Tricks Complete Guide to Grid. The properties for the grid items, we see we have grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, grid row end, and all of these. These are basically ways to span multiple columns and rows to span an area, which you remember is like a whole rectangle. And there's some properties down here to affect the top, bottom, middle, and center, and left and right alignments down here for the actual grid cell. So let's try to span multiple rows using the grid row start and grid row end. So in our code, we have our grid items defined with this CSS selector saying we want all divs that are direct children of the container. So how do we select this first one in order to apply that grid row start and grid row end property? So we're going to do that with the same kind of selector. So we're going to say we want the direct children of container, but we only want the first one. So we're going to use a pseudo class first of type. Now we can specify the grid row start will be on row 1. So this grid row start takes a line number that we are going to start with. And if we look at this, we can see how the lines are named. So the first line is line 1, second line is line 2, and so forth. And that's the same thing with the columns. So if we want to start at line 1 and extend down to line 3, we could say 1 and then grid row end at 3. So in this case, we want the number 1 to be on the left side and 2, 3, 4 to be on the right side. So we're going to make cell 1 span from 1 to 4. Let's try that. Let's see what happened. Now we have a big 1 over here and then 2, 3, 4 over here. Now you can start to see how this is so powerful for layouts in our page. One of the most powerful features of grids is that you can do entire page layouts pretty simply with grids, and this was not so simple in the past with CSS, so this is very exciting that you're getting in right here when grids are being supported by all major browsers. So you're very lucky in this case. So for instance, if we check out this W3 Schools page, we see there's a layout where we have this header bar at the top, we have navigation on the left, and we have the content here and some ads over here, and we have a footer all the way down here. Now this is a similar layout as right here, right? So we had the header at the top, the menu on the side, this main content, the right side, and the footer. We can define all of this in CSS using the grid template areas. Let's go to the code to define our grid template areas. So right now we have the 1, 2, 3, 4 from the previous example where this giant 1's over here and you have the 2, 3, 4. We could define a layout using these grid row start and grid row end properties, but using these properties can get a little daunting and hard to do, especially when you get into responsive web design, which when we design for mobile and desktop at the same time. So it can be hard to keep track of which lines go where in mobile versus desktop. So a more visual way to do this is with grid template areas. So we need to create several sections down here to mimic a giant web page. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of these grid row starts and grid row ends, and we'll keep everything else the same. So that'll just give us back this 2x2 grid. So we want to have 5 elements on the page to follow what we have on this example here. We're going to have a header, a menu, main, right, and footer. And to do these, we're going to use HTML semantic elements. So instead of saying all divs here, why don't we go ahead and use the header, and we'll put header text in here. We'll create a menu using nav. We'll do the main content with main. Then we'll do a right sidebar with an aside, and we can put a class on here that says right sidebar or something like that. We can actually call it ads which makes more sense. You know, in CSS, in HTML, we don't really want to have a concept of left or right or anything like that. We want to do all of our placement and styling in our CSS. That makes our HTML much more flexible later for you know, someone really specialized in web design to come in and take control of how the page looks. All right, and last, we'll put in a footer. Let's go ahead and get rid of these divs down here. Now we go back to our page here. We notice these are separated into grid items, but we lost all that styling that we had with the divs before, where the text was centered and larger. So let's get that back. So if you see here, the selector that was doing that styling is selecting the child divs. We actually want to select the child header, nav, main, side, and footer. Now we could make a separate thing for each of these. So we could say child header, comma, dot container, nav, and so on and so forth. And we'd have to do them one at a time. A shortcut for this is to use the wildcard selector here. Now that did all of the children at once. Oh, main content. Let's fix that. Now if we check our complete guide to grid, we see the grid template areas property is a property for the grid container. So grid template areas defines a grid template by referencing the names of the grid areas which are specified with the grid area property. So this is a little bit confusing, but let's look, what is a grid area first? So grid area is actually a property on the grid item. So these are the children of the grid container. If we go to grid area, we give an item a name so that it can be referenced by a template created with the grid template areas property. Just check this out. What is grid template areas? What does it finally look like at the end? So in this example, we see right here, the grid template areas property looks like 3 strings here. It has header, 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 main, main, dot, sidebar, footer, 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 footer. So what does this mean? So this means it'll create a grid that is 4 columns, because it has 4 words in each section or period to represent a blank cell. And then it has 3 rows, because there are 3 strings. Now if we format our grid template areas CSS like this, we can see the layout of the page in text right here. We know the header is going to go across the top, the main content is going to be on the left side, sidebar is going to be on the right, and the footer is going to be all the way across the bottom. Now this is a powerful system. Let's use it in our code. So to create our grid template areas, we need to first assign our elements, our grid items here, to grid areas. We need to name them grid areas. So we're going to name these based on these tags up here. So we can say in the container, the direct child header, which is our first grid item, will be assigned to the grid area of header. The nav will be assigned to a grid area of nav. These names do not have to match here. I'm just matching them for simplicity's sake. The main will be defined as grid area of main. Next we have an aside, which is the add sidebar. So let's use that class instead. Oops. Add sidebar will be a grid area of ads, and the footer will be a grid area of footer. Now we can use these grid areas in a grid template. So we're going to get rid of these grid template columns and instead use grid template areas. So in the first row, we're just going to have the header. Let's just start with 1 column per row and see what happens. And the next, we'll use the nav menu. So we called this nav, so we're going to use the grid area name of nav. then we have the main content and ads, which we want to put on the same section as the nav. So we're going to go ahead and put the main and the ads here. So the first row has to have the same number of columns as the second row. So let's go ahead and say that the header is going to span all 3 columns. And then let's make the footer span all 3 columns as well. And let's add a semicolon at the end and see what we have. Now notice our main content's all the way down here. So there was a mistake here. Let's check out what it is. So we have main right here, correct spot. Oh, but the grid area name was off. So let's fix that grid area name. And refresh. Much better. So now we have our header at the top, we have a menu, we have main content, ads, and the footer at the bottom. As main content, we want it to take up more space than this menu and the ads. So let's add some more span for this main column. And then we will add 2 more columns to the top row and 2 more columns to the bottom row. Now we see our main content is spanning a little bit more. So this is taking up 3/5 of the space, this takes up 1/5, and this takes up 1/5. And when we resize our browser window, we see it continues to take up that same proportional space. In the W3 Schools example, we saw the menu spanning multiple rows here. So let's make the menu extend into the footer. To do that, all we need to do is put nav as the first column in the footer row. Save that and refresh, and now we see our menu and our layout exactly like this layout here. And it's reflected in this text here. It is very visual on how we can define this layout. Next, let's see how this is powerful with responsive web design. Grids make responsive web design pretty simple, and that's one of the other powerful things about this new layout tool. So what is responsive web design? Responsive web design basically is a methodology you follow in order to make your page look good on both mobile and browser while still using the same HTML. So we're going to use CSS to display certain styles when we're on mobile versus desktop. So for example, if we look here, the desktop site has the menu and the header and the ads and the content and the footer on the bottom, and that's just like our layout we have here. But this kind of layout doesn't really work on a tablet or a phone. This main content gets squeezed pretty hard. So on a tablet, maybe you'd want the menu to be on the top left and the content to be here and put the ad along the bottom. But on a phone, you would want the navigation links to just span the entire site, because that's going to be too little space for your thumb to click those links. So we need to think about how the user is looking at these on what device and how they can interact with the page and create CSS specific for each of these various scenarios. When we're creating a responsive web design, what we want to do is something called mobile first. And that methodology means designing your site for a mobile device first, and then using media queries to design your site for the desktop and the tablets. And the mobile will technically work on any of these scenarios. So it won't look that pretty on a desktop, it won't look as pretty as this, but you could still use this phone layout on desktop. So that's why you start with mobile first, because you can't use a desktop version on the phone. It's going to look ugly, but you can definitely use the phone version on the desktop. It just does not look like it's formatted for the desktop exactly. So our phone design we're going to do in our straight CSS here. Now notice our grid template areas are set up for desktop. Let's change these to be set up for phone first. So to do that, we are going to actually put all of our nav on one row. unless instead of using 5 columns, which 1/5 of a column on a phone is going to look tiny, we'll just use 2 columns. We could even use just 1 column if we wanted to. In fact, let's just use 1 column. These are all going to span across. So we're going to do our main content after the nav. Then we're going to do our ads, and then our footer on the bottom. Now let's see what happened to our page. So now we have a mobile layout with everything spanning the entire width. So now let's move on to the desktop version of our CSS. So to do this desktop version, we're going to use media queries. So media queries let us create CSS that will only apply when certain conditions are met with either the viewport or the device. So in this case, we're going to vary it based on the width of the browser. So we're going to say at media screen, so only for desktops, and the min width is greater than 768 pixels, which is a random desktop width. You could go from there. Usually phones are up to usually 480 pixels, and tablets are usually around 480 to 768, and then desktops can be considered above 768 pixels. So this is how much screen real estate, the minimum screen real estate we'll be working with. So here, all we're going to do is override some of the CSS we wrote for the mobile site. So all of this CSS is going to apply, but in addition, we're going to apply this CSS only when the screen width is greater than 768 pixels. So we want to affect the grid template areas when the screen gets bigger. So we're going to go with our original design with the 5-column layout with 5 headers on top, the nav on the left, then the main content, and the main content, and main content, and the ads. In fact, let's put a little bit of space between the main content and the navigation. And to do that, we're going to replace this main with a period, which is a placeholder for an empty cell. So that's just going to be a blank cell there. Next, we're going to put the footer across all 5 columns down here. So now that we have that, let's go back to our site and see how it looks. So now our site is showing the desktop version because this browser is over 768 pixels wide. So we can check our responsive version by resizing our browser. And now we see we have the mobile site when our browser gets below 768 pixels. Now, resizing the browser can be pretty annoying, so there's actually a way you can do this with the developer tools. So the Chrome developer tools allow us to view a responsive version of our site. So we open up the Chrome developer tools. We see there's a button right here that is to toggle the device toolbar. So let's go ahead and click that. So now we see our site as if it were on a mobile phone, and we see it's 45% size. We can make it a little bit bigger, but the fit to Windows size is 45%. Now look, our content is actually laying out as a desktop version still. What happened? Well, we forgot to set the viewport. So in responsive web design, it is important to set the viewport tag as a meta tag in your head. So what does that look like? The viewport tag, the one we're going to use for this class is generally going to look like this. So we can copy and paste this exact line into our code. What this says is that the viewport is going to be matching the device width with a zoom scale of 1.0. Let's go ahead and put that in our head. We can put it near the top if we'd like. And now let's go back to our site and check it out. There we go. Now the Galaxy S5 has the correct mobile version. And if we go to the iPad version, we see that's 768 pixels, so it's going to get the desktop version. And if we increase to responsive, we can actually freely resize this width as we see fit, or even set it up here. So now that we have all our beautiful code, how do we submit our labs? So we're going to do that with Git. So we need to commit the changes we made and then push them up to the server. This is this two-stage process where we're basically committing to our local repository and then we're pushing those changes up to the remote repository, which is on GitHub. If we see here, our index.html is green. That means there's changes we have that haven't been committed to Git yet. So let's open our terminal and do it through there. So first thing we can do is git status. And here we can see all the files that were new or modified, and files that just are not tracked at all. Now these .idea, that's the IDE folder. We don't need to actually monitor that. Next week I'll go over how to just completely ignore it so it doesn't even show up here. But for now, let's just ignore it. Next, we are going to go ahead and add the changes that were not staged for commit. So here we're going to add the index.html. So we're going to say git add index.html. Now we can do git status and see if there's still changes not staged for commit. So it looks like everything, all the changes are staged for commit now, changes to be committed. So we're going to go ahead and commit them. And we're going to specify a message right here. So we're going to say something like finished lab. Now if we do a git status, we see there our branch is ahead of origin master by 1 commit. So we're going to push that commit up to the branch. We can do that with git push. So now if we go to our GitHub repository, we can see the index.html is here. And if we go into that, we can see the code we put inside of our index.html and make sure it is the current code. And we see down here it has the media queries. That's the last thing we did, so it's showing up right down here. So now we have successfully submitted our project to GitHub. So in conclusion, grids are an awesome way to do layouts in CSS. They allow for easy responsive web design. This is the system for layouts. There was really no system for layouts like this in CSS before, even HTML. You had to build it using all these combinations of techniques for positioning and layouts and absolute layouts, and it was just a pain to manage. And it wouldn't work on every browser. You'd have to have all these different ways to customize it for every browser. But Grid is a common standard across all the browsers now, and I'm very excited for it. So let's all design our layouts with grids now and use them as much as we can because I'm enjoying them.